Welcome back. Dr. Robert Watson is a presidential historian. He's written his 34th book. It took him 10 years to write it, and it's his favorite one so far. It's all about presidential sex scandals and more. So who was the biggest dog in the White House? Let's find out. Robert, it is great to have you here. Thanks for coming in.
My pleasure.
This is going to be a fun one. Of all the historians who've written all the books on presidents, this is a very unique take. Affairs of State. Tell me the inspiration for writing this one.
It's a little different. It's unlike anything I've ever done before as well. Here's my inspiration, if you will. My thought was when I became a professor, what possibly could I add to the knowledge on George Washington? We know everything about Washington. The best scholars have spent a lifetime reading every letter Washington ever wrote. Was I going to get the one letter that they forgot to turn over and they missed the backside of it? So my thought was, while we know everything about Washington, we didn't study the person that knew Washington the best, his wife. And what we find, for example, is we celebrate the fact that Washington endured Valley Forge, the freezing cold and rudimentary conditions. Well, guess who was there with him? His wife, Martha, with her little white bonnet on. But she doesn't get any credit for all of that. So my thought was that, all these men are said to be self-made men. But the more you read, you realize that a lot of them are wife-made men or mother-made men. So I figured, let's look at the hand of a woman, the mother, the wife, but also, as per this book, the hand of a mistress,
right.
and how that may have shaped history.
And with some of these presidents, the hand of multiple mistresses.
Oh, sure.
Multiple
Kennedy.
hands going on, yeah.
Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, Warren Harding. I guess my line is that when you come to affairs in high office, that Bill Clinton wasn't the first and wasn't the worst. He sure as heck won't be the last.
Okay, well, let's roll up the sleeves.
Okay.
Let's get into the gossip and the dirt, if you will.
Sure.
Some of these guys are dogs, were dogs, it would
yeah.
seem. Give me a few of your favorite stories.
Well, Kennedy probably had the most mistresses of anyone, just sheer volumes. I mean, multiple a week while he's married, while he's the president. Multiple women per week. It's amazing. He had two young secretaries, I guess I should put it in quotes.
Right.
They nicknamed them Fiddle and Faddle. Needless to say, neither one typed. And what they would do is they would check into the White House, usually around lunchtime, and it appears that they'd have a threesome with the president, or they'd go skinny dipping with him, they'd serve lunch, and then they'd get cleaned up and leave the White House. And it sure seems that Jackie Kennedy knew, but she just didn't want to be confronted with it, because what Jackie would do is she would always call ahead when she would come back to the White House and give her ETA when she's arriving. And there was one quick one, there was a maid who worked in the Kennedy White House who taped an interview years later for the Kennedy Library. And she says that she's in the Kennedy and Mrs. Kennedy had separate bedrooms, by the way. So she's in John Kennedy's bedroom changing the sheets. And Jackie's in the closet picking out a suit for whatever party was that night. And the maid pulls the pillowcase off and a little pair of panties fall out. So the maid says she was mortified. And Jackie Kennedy, while picking out clothes in the closet, a suit, turns to the maid and says, quote unquote, "Get rid of those, they're not mine," and then turns back around in the closet as if to say, is it going to rain tonight? What suit should I pick out? So, this stuff, it's needless to say, there's a long history of it.
How do you run the most important nation in the universe while you're with multiple mistresses a day and a week?
First off, I'm not advocating anything I wrote
Sure,
about in here,
right.
and all my research was scholarly, I assure you. It was not personal research. But all presidents, I guess pun intended, need some downtime. Running the world's, it's the most important job in the world. And what we've seen is, whether it was Richard Nixon bowling, Barack Obama shooting some hoop, Thomas Jefferson and George Washington loved to ride horses. These are real folks, after all.
Yeah, I mean, bowling, shooting hoops, sleeping with multiple women, whatever you need to do.
It's not like non-presidents don't do this,
Sure.
and sure, it's not like folks in Congress don't do this as well. So why, in some ways, should they be any different? And what you might suggest is that the higher the office, simply the more room there is and the farther you fall when you make a mistake. And Lyndon Johnson, Warren Harding, there were a number of these guys that could be labeled flat-out dogs from history.
Well, we've got a few minutes left. Give me some more. Give me another good one.
Well, Thomas Jefferson appears to have had an affair with a young woman named Sally Hemings,
right,
who was a slave mistress. Here's the kicker. Sally Hemings and Jefferson's wife, Martha Wales Skelton Jefferson, she died about 18, 19 years before Jefferson's presidency. Young Sally Hemings, the slave mistress, and Jefferson's wife were half-sisters. It was Jefferson's wife's father, John Wales, who was the father of both these folks. So here's what we know. Martha, Mrs. Jefferson, was the debutante of all of Tidewater, Virginia. The most beautiful woman, talented. Her mother was beautiful. The father was handsome and fantastic. Little Sally was a half-sister to this beautiful woman. She must have been a more exotic version of her. There are no likenesses of Sally, but there are descriptions. They called her the African Venus, dusky Sally the temptress. Prominent men in Parisian society would meet this little girl. She's a teenager, which is, it's not romantic, it's more statutory, more creepy. They'd meet this teenage girl and call her the African Venus. I mean, she must have been Beyonce or Halle Berry or something. I mean, just remarkable. Thomas Jefferson had lost his wife. He was depressed. He seemed to be on the rebound. I'm not condoning, not green lighting, but I guess it is what it is. But they spent years together, and it appears that she had 5 children with Thomas Jefferson.
You know what's interesting is, all right, so we've talked about Kennedy and we've talked about Thomas Jefferson. These are 2 of the more beloved presidents of our history, right?
Sure.
Is there a correlation? I mean, do we glorify them in part because of this?
Well, the French would probably say that if they're in a horse race, they don't want a gelding. In the horse race, you want a bull in the horse race. And the French seem to take pride, I guess, in the misbehavior of their leaders. On one hand, here's what I'll say, and with the Petraeus scandal so relevant, I don't agree with what they did, and we must hold our elected officials to a higher moral standard. I've always advocated that. I've written about that for my whole career. On the other hand, I would certainly take an Eisenhower during World War II, even though he had an affair with Kay Summersby, the British driver. I'd take Ike any day over Montgomery. I would take FDR during the Great Depression with all of his mistresses any day over, Mr. Dewey or someone else, or Wendell Willkie. George Washington, apropos to the Petraeus scandal, Petraeus gets in trouble for his emails with Miss Broadwell. George Washington was writing very hot and heavy letters to a woman named Sally Fairfax, who wasn't his wife. I'll take Washington in the French and Indian War, the Revolution, any day with the mistress over, let's say, a Millard Fillmore who appears to have been faithful. So, again, I'm not condoning it. I don't know that you can say that the more active ones were the better ones, because so many of them did it. I think there's some on either end.
All right, one more. Abe Lincoln. Got to talk about him.
Okay, Abe. Well, it appears that even Abe once visited a prostitute.
Shocker.
I know. Say
Honest
it isn't
Abe
so.
Lincoln.
Honest Abe.
Come on.
Well, I think you hit it on the head there. He was honest. What happened was Lincoln's best friend was a guy named Joshua Speed, and they lived together.
And they slept together.
And they slept together. They did. They shared a
Right.
bed. And when Lincoln was a county judge, a lawyer rather, he would travel with a judge and another lawyer all around the place, and they would stay at these boarding homes. There were no Holiday Inns back then. A boarding house had one big long bed, and everybody, like the Who's in Whoville in that movie, would line up and sleep in the bed. So Lincoln was always sleeping in bed with men. It's the way they did it back then.
So there's nothing extracurricular going on.
No. I don't think Lincoln was gay, and not during his marriage, but he did visit a prostitute. I'll cut to the chase.
Okay.
He tells his friend Speed, I've got to have a woman. Speed says, I'm sleeping with this prostitute. You can have her. So only Abe would do this. Abe appears to have asked Speed for a letter of introduction with a woman. He visits her. He only has $3. She charges him $5. He says, ma'am, I don't have the money. She says, you can pay me when you come into it. He said, ma'am, I'm so broke, I don't have the money. And then he gets up and runs out. He was too afraid. So he turned out to be honest Abe at the end of the
It's amazing. All that was left out of the movie about his life.
I love Spielberg, but that wasn't in the movie.
He left that out. Well, listen, we could do this for an hour and a half. We're out of time, but really quickly, let me give you a chance to plug your book. How can people get it, and what's next for you?
Well, it's called Affairs of State. It's the publisher's Roman and Littlefield, big publishing house. You can get it through Amazon.com, BarnesandNoble.com, all the usual sources.
And you've got part 2 coming up shortly,
I'm
right?
going to write a sequel in about 2 years. They always say everything should be in trilogies, so maybe I'll have to do 3.
Great.
There's enough scandals there.
And you'll come back for the next one.
I'd be delighted.
So great to meet you.
Pleasure.
All right,
Pleasure.
take care. When we come back, heart disease is a leading killer of men and women in this country. So how can you stay safe and protect your heart? That answer when Inside South Florida returns.